Hi class and welcome back to virtual learning. Today we're going to be covering the Age of Exploration. So the Age of Exploration starts in the 1400s and lasts all the way to the 1700s. So as Europeans gradually begin to sail to parts of the Americas and Asia, you start to see an uptick as it becomes a trend, and all the nations basically start doing it that are located with a coast that have access to the sea. So you have countries like England, you have Spain, France, Portugal especially, and you see a lot of people trying to head westward across the Atlantic Ocean. As we know from the Middle Ages, Asia was connected to Europe by one particular famous trade route. Do you guys remember which trade route that was? I'll give you some time to think about it. It was the Silk Road, right? And the Silk Road connected both continents and allowed a free exchange of goods to happen. A lot of the things they traded were teas, salt, sugar, porcelain, spices, cotton, ivory, wool. All of those things were traded along this particular trade route. One of the things that they were looking to do was to find a quicker way to Asia. But as the political climate began to change along the Silk Road, the route became a little inhospitable. Inhospitable means like it wasn't very friendly or conducive to trade. People were a little bit more afraid to travel it because it was getting a little shady. So Europeans were looking for a new way to travel by sea so they can kind of skip the Middle East and go straight to Asia, so it would be a quicker journey and there wouldn't be so many stops along the way. They'd have a direct path, which would make it a whole lot easier. So in order to do this, there had to be a change, right? Because before it wasn't possible by sea, but as new things start to be invented, it becomes a much more realistic thing, and the likelihood of it happening increases. One of the biggest reasons why overseas travel became possible was because all the new inventions that were coming out. The new inventions allowed them to kind of track where they were a little bit better and see where they were going, and this made it possible for them to feel a little bit more confident. One of these inventions that they used for sailing was the astrolabe. It was an ancient Greek instrument that determined where people were latitude-wise based off of where the stars and the sun was. So this was something that had been around for a long time, but it eventually made it back into Europe through trade with the Arabs. So you're probably asking yourself, why is this device important? Well, it told the explorers how far north or south they've been on the globe because it determined latitude. So you kind of know if you're going in a straight line or if you're going south or if you're going north, and it helped them determine where they were charted as they sailed. The next thing that made sailing possible was the invention of new boats. One of them was the carrack, or the carrack. It was a large sailing vessel that had 3 or 4 masses. So those are the big wooden things that stick up, that have sails on them. So it was a bigger boat that allowed them to carry more stuff, and it was the perfect size for longer sea voyages because they could keep their supplies on there and their cargo and basically everything they needed to trade and to get back to where they came from. So the next thing that made traveling possible along the sea was the invention of the caravel. It was a small, more maneuverable boat or vessel. Vessel is another word for a boat, and for those of you who like science fiction, that's usually the word they use to refer to it. It's like spaceships, just for those who care. And it was used for sailing by the Spanish and the Portuguese. The Portuguese, most importantly, used it to sail around the tip of Africa. So you're probably thinking to yourself, didn't they have boats before? What changed, right? Why are these ships important? What's the big deal? Well, these new types of boats were made specifically for trade and for long distance sailing. So one of the big differences was they used triangular sails instead of square sails. So we know that the explorers could travel long distances, and these new boats and their new navigational tools helped them get to distant places. But you're probably asking yourselves, well, what did they eat? Interestingly enough, they had to prepare all their food ahead of time because when they were on the ocean, you might be able to catch a few fish, but a lot of that food had to be prepared ahead of time. Can you guys think of a way to preserve meat or vegetables that would work in a long-term type of situation? One way is by pickling, right? They would put vegetables in a jar and put different kinds of liquids. Now we use vinegar and stuff like that. But they would pickle their vegetables, so they would stay good, and then they would unseal the jar and eat out of them over the span of their journey. They would also cure meats by salting them, which made them last way longer. Again, this was a technique that was really old and had been used for centuries, but it's something we kind of forget about because we have the luxury of, using refrigerators and freezers. But these are the type of food preservation methods that they used back then, and they were still really effective on the high seas, but they still did run into the problem of just running out of food. Now you're probably asking yourself, well, who was the one doing the sailing? What nations were able to get out there on the seas and explore? So it's important to note that England and France at this time were still fighting the Hundred Years' War. So they were a little bit busy. And during the 1400s, Spain was still busy with the Reconquista. So this meant Portugal was the first nation to be able to travel around the world and kind of get out there on the seas because they weren't preoccupied fighting somebody or, doing other things. An interesting thing about Portugal is its particular location on the map within Europe. So I'm going to go ahead and put a map on the screen and think about it for a second. Identify where Portugal is and think about what advantages they might have based off of their location geographically. So you probably guessed it. Portugal is located on the Iberian Peninsula and is at the very tip. So because they're located on the very tip, they're kind of the furthest out into the Atlantic Ocean. So at this time, Portugal's prince was really excited to start exploring. He even gained the nickname Henry the Navigator because he was so eager to hire people to set off on voyages and find new places to trade. The Portuguese would sail south around Africa and eventually make it to Asia. Some of these early Portuguese sailors were Bartolomeu Diaz and Vasco da Gama. Now here's a name you guys might recognize. Christopher Columbus. He was a navigator from Genoa, Italy, and he was looking for anyone to hire him to sail to Asia. After years of searching, he eventually found investors in 1492, and it was Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. They were Spanish royalty from different parts of Spain because Spain wasn't unified yet. And they agreed to support Columbus on his journey because they had just finished defeating the Muslims and Spain was eager to spread their Spanish influence across the world. So Columbus set sail west from Spain with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, thinking that, hey, if I sail west, I'm just going to end up on the other side of the earth and it's going to be Asia. And there you go. Problem solved. We'll have a perfect trade route and we won't need to use the Silk Road anymore. However, his journey took longer than he anticipated, and when Columbus eventually did hit land, it wasn't Asia. He was in the Caribbean Sea, and as we know, that's the wrong side of the earth. Columbus named the first island that he landed on San Salvador, and his other ships would eventually reach modern-day islands that we now know as Cuba and the Dominican Republic. Columbus would return to Europe eventually, and he'd quickly be sent back because Spanish royalty was eager to bring back more wildlife, gold, and spices like he had originally brought back. However, this time the Spanish brought their soldiers known as conquistadors, and instead of engaging with trade in them like they did before, they enslaved the Taino people. And because they weren't familiar with a lot of the modern technologies and wildlife of Europe, they were super scared of the big horses, which they had never seen, and the guns, which were mind-blowing to them. In 1494, there would be an agreement signed between Spain and Portugal pre-dividing the lands in the Americas, and this was known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. It's important to note that most people still thought Columbus had reached Asia until Amerigo Vespucci sailed west, and that was finally corrected. And that's why North and South America are named after him. It's also important to know that Christopher Columbus wasn't the first European to reach the Americas. The Vikings had sailed west and established colonies in Canada and Greenland in the 10th century. So the myth is that Christopher Columbus was the first man to make it here, but that's not the truth. So into the 1500s, Spain continued to explore the Americas, but they were still looking for a way to make it to Asia by sailing west. They didn't want to go around Africa. It took too long. So they were thinking, well, maybe we'll just sail around the Americas. So in order to make that attempt, they recruited the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan's goal was to sail west and then south around the Americas in order to make it to Asia. So instead of sailing around South America, he actually found a little shortcut, and it was an inlet of water that was between Argentina and Chile that let him kind of take a shorter route. And eventually he reached the Pacific Ocean. And it's important to remember that Magellan actually named the Pacific Ocean because he saw it and he thought it was so peaceful. And that's where the word Pacific comes from. It comes from the word peaceful. So the journey to Asia was actually way more difficult than Magellan had anticipated, and he didn't realize how big the Pacific Ocean was because nobody had ever sailed that way. So on this journey, the sailors started to run out of supplies, and they had to drink contaminated water, and they had to eat leather and sawdust and rats. After 4 months of traveling on the Pacific Ocean, Magellan and his crew finally made it to the Philippines, and unfortunately for him, he would eventually be killed in a small battle going on in the Philippines. So after resupplying, the rest of his crew would eventually sail back to Spain by going through the Indian Ocean and north of Africa. Upon reaching Spain, Magellan's crew would have officially circumnavigated the globe. And that's a word they use to explain when you go all the way around the world. So the tragic thing about Magellan's journey was they had left Spain with 270 men in 5 boats. And once they eventually made it back, they only had 17 of the original crew members and 1 of the same boats. And Magellan himself didn't even make it. Another important explorer of the Age of Exploration was the English-born sea captain Francis Drake. Drake was known as the second man to sail around the Earth, and his journey took place between 1577 and 1580. Unlike Magellan, the first person to sail around the Earth, Drake stopped a lot more along the way. By stopping more, it made his journey way easier because he was able to kind of replenish his supplies as much as possible. One of the places Drake stopped was just north of San Francisco, and it's a place that's been named after him, and it's called Drake's Bay. Some of you might have visited it. After leaving California, it took Drake 68 days to cross the Pacific Ocean. To put that into perspective, with a plane, you could probably do the same trip in 14 hours or more. So between 14 and 15 hours. So 68 days, 14, 15 hours, which one would you guys rather pick? So now we're gonna go ahead and compare the 2 different trips around the world. And I'm gonna go ahead and put a map up on the screen that you guys are gonna be able to look at. So as you can see, Drake sailed much closer to the western coasts of North and South America. And by doing so, again, it was a benefit to him because they weren't stuck in the middle of the ocean like Magellan was for such a long time. The only reason why this was possible was because Magellan had sailed 50 to 60 years before Francis Drake. So this is why maps are important, right? It lets people know what else is out there so they can use those to benefit them in the future. So Francis Drake is a little bit of a controversial figure. He was known for attacking Spanish ships and ports during his journey around the Earth. He had been pre-approved by Queen Elizabeth to do whatever was necessary in order to make the journey beneficial to her financially. It was these exploits that gave Drake the reputation of being a bit of a pirate. By the way, this is the same queen that supported William Shakespeare and funded a lot of his works. When he eventually finished circumnavigating the globe, Queen Elizabeth herself visited his boat and celebrated him because he received the full hero's welcome. And Queen Elizabeth would eventually knight him as well. So his name, as he's known as, is Sir Francis Drake now. So thank you for watching my video. One of the benefits of having these online is that you guys can always watch them again. So if you missed something, or if you think something wasn't clear enough, or if you were busy writing your notes, whatever it may be, go ahead and watch them again. Feel free to leave comments on our class's page and to message me directly if you have any additional questions. Again, thank you for watching.